Okay, I think we're ready to begin. So, hello and good evening, and welcome to Care Work and the Hidden Labor of Women. This panel is the second of a 4 session series of webinars on gender and the changing world of work that Prajna is organizing with the Frederick Ebert Stiftung India. I am Archanaa Seker, a volunteer with Prajna, and I also work as a research manager with Lead at Kriya University, and I'm very happy to be moderating this panel today. Let's begin with a short AV clip made by FES Global. This clip is called Who Cares? Recognition and Dignity for Care Workers in Asia. And I think it will help us set the context for today's discussion. So I'm just going to share my screen and play this clip for us. Just a second. That was a very short but great video. I think that um, gives us many things to think about and talk about today. Those include, how does unpaid household labor factor into women's negotiations with paid employment? How do and what do schools, companies, and households expect from women in terms of reproductive and care work? What does the trope of work-life balance conceal with respect to gendered inequalities in access to work? And how does care work get hidden in the many of the policy decisions and the household structures that we live with? And most importantly, I think today COVID-19 has also given us the chance really to think about how not we talk about this now currently in the COVID context, but also how the pandemic has helped us sort of reflect on the inequalities and the structures that already exist. With that, I would like to introduce our panelists for the day. We have 4 very, very esteemed panelists, and I'm just going to read out their bios to all of us. We have Lekha Chakraborty. Professor Lekha Chakraborty is a senior economist at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. She is also affiliated as a research associate with the Levy Economics Institute of Bard College, New York. She is a pioneering researcher in institutionalizing gender budgeting in India. She has worked for organizations such as the IMF, the World Bank, the UNDP, and UN Women, where she has applied a macroeconomic perspective to gender equality and women's economic empowerment. And then we have Meeta Sengupta. who is a writer, speaker, and advisor on education with a cross-country perspective on policy, skills, and pedagogies. She has written extensively on school systems, assessments, and outcomes, and on education gaps and funding. She has been published by Springer Books and in various national and international media outlets. She is also the founder of the Center for Education Strategy, which runs projects such as the School Safety Campaign. Our third speaker is Shraddha Chigateri. Dr. Shraddha is an independent gender and development researcher. She has previously worked as an academic at universities in the UK as a research fellow at the Institute of Social Studies Trust, New Delhi, and as a researcher and evaluator for various organizations on projects related to women's work. She is currently working as a consultant with Gender at Work India on a collaborative research project led by the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex. Rajani Seshadri is the fourth speaker we have with us today. Rajani is the co-founder of Independent Connections, an organization committed to providing resources, support, and a helping hand to women who wish to return to work. She is also an accredited executive coach. She has many decades of experience working at Tata Consultancy Services and other companies in the IT industry, and is passionate about advancing gender diversity and inclusion in the corporate workspace. She is a founder member of the Confederation of Indian Industries, Indian Women Network. And with that, I call upon Lekha Chakraborty to speak to us today.
Thank you so much for your warm introduction. And this topic is very close to my heart, on how to integrate gender in the macroeconomic framework. And the clip you have shown about the care economy, that's the real issue regarding the gender budgeting. We could not do much regarding integrating the care economy into the macroeconomic policy framework. And I know that we have a minister, we have a finance minister who is very were passionate about gender budgeting, because when she was in National Women's Commission, she came to an IPFP and we have brainstormed on how the classification of budgetary transactions can be altered to integrate gender into the policy framework, especially the budgetary framework. So I hope for the best that the government will be doing, so many positive things to integrate the care economy into the macro policy framework, especially against the backdrop of this COVID pandemic. And what is announced so far by our government in the economic package for the COVID-19 was a cash transfer for the women and the gender budgeting in energy structure. So these two were the clear announcements in the policy package for the pandemic, to tackle the pandemic. But these are partial, and I expect that there's kind of a firefighting economic policy to deal with this issue. And regarding the health policy, the infrastructure, as we know that in our country, the public expenditure to GDP that in health sector is as less as 1% of GDP. So if we have to, integrate the care economy, we need to, look into this sector very closely, because the health providers' perspective is not integrated into our policy framework. So the moment we talk about the care work and the care economy providers, the government just stop by decreasing the days of hospitalization, then you cannot think about the care economy provider's perspective, that who is providing the care. That's a kind of a partial thing if you just focus on market economy and deny the care economy. I hope the example which I am trying to tell you is very clear. What I am telling is, if the policy makers are focusing just on the care economy work, that we go out and work, and also the kind of austerity measures introducing the spending on health, a kind of burden which is on the care economy, that is not yet acknowledged, and the household care providers' perspectives are not integrated into the care system. So this is the point number one that I would like to highlight. Then second is the statistical invisibility of the care sector itself. We need to have innovative data management to absorb the care economy sector. And luckily, in our region, India has the macro level time use survey data. And in our country, we have the time use survey data, and this kind of innovative data, how we can explore and how we can read to understand the statistical invisibility of the care sector and how it can be integrated into the fiscal policy frameworks, gender budgeting, and the other kind of policy frameworks we need to work. And I heard that Center for Statistical Organization is already into updating the data on time use survey, and I hope that we get this data for all the states in India. So that's data is the second thing. And the third point is, though we get the data, how we analyze and how we get this into the policy making is very crucial. So gender budgeting so far has focused on government activities so care economy. What I'm telling you is that even if government on employment generation, like our Manrega and other kind of employment generation programs, the women are time poor. So unless we tackle the time poverty of women, we won't get them to work in the market sector. So my point is, employment policies can go partial unless we work on the care economy infrastructure and tackle the time poverty of women, because this time poverty affects income poverty. So unless we deal the time poverty of the women, we won't be able to get them to work. So these are kinds of innovative thinking. If we can do the policies can work better. Archana, I stop here and take questions later.
Yes, sure, Lekha. This is great. Thank you so much. I think you've already given us lots to think about, and for also the other speakers to address. So thank you so much. Now, Meeta will join us just a little bit later. So I request Shraddha to go on next. And Shraddha will be joining, Shraddha will be sharing with us some work she's done with colleagues at ISST from this project called My Work Never Ends, Experiences of Women from Low Income Households of Balancing Unpaid Care Work and Paid Work. Over to you, Shraddha.
Hi everyone. Thank you again to Rajani and to all of you for inviting me, to Dr. Sarna Rajgopal and Archanaa. It's really a wonderful panel, again, a subject close to my heart. And I'm so pleased to see that Mubashira Zairi is here. Hello, Mubashira. I just wanted to say that the research that I want that I've done with her and other colleagues at ISST, including Anvecha Books, Meeta Sengupta and Kitty Rowland and others at the Institute of Development Studies. Drawing on this research, I want to make a larger case, that public policy, specifically on paid work and childcare, but extending into other realms of care work to inadequately address the conditions that create imbalance between paid and unpaid care work, which has seriously depleting effects on the physical and mental well-being of women, particularly from low-income households. And we can talk a bit more about this, but as research has already begun to uncover, COVID-19 and the subsequent brutal lockdown in the country have had a deep impact on women's work in general, and their unpaid care work in particular, both exposing already existing fault lines of vulnerability and precarity in our society, as well as further deepening and exacerbating inequalities. I mean, just one statistic. And again, ISST has done some work on the increase in the levels of unpaid care work that women workers, particularly from informal work sectors, have experienced. But also, people losing their jobs, experiencing increased food security. I think there was another study by ActionAid which showed that 78% of all informal workers surveyed, both male and female, lost their livelihoods. And for some sectors of feminized employment, such as domestic work, this loss in livelihood was as much as 85%. So you can imagine the kinds of high levels of precarity that. So I don't know what you've got so far, except I did want to say that, COVID-19 has increased already, has exposed already existing fault lines of vulnerability and precarity in our society, as well as further deepened and exacerbated inequalities. And this has been particularly the case for women in low income households who are more likely to work in informal employment and in vulnerable categories of work such as domestic work, home based work, street vending, daily wage agricultural work. So then, I understood that one of the key themes of this talk was to look at work life balance and what it means for women. The ways in which women are not even able to get on the threshold of work because of responsibilities, but also what happens when women are they really able to achieve any semblance of work life balance, or a balance between work and other spheres of life when both work and life have been upended in already precarious contexts? For our research at ISST, rather than the construct of work-life balance, we focused on interrogating and addressing the balance between paid work and unpaid care work, thereby centering work, especially the hidden aspects of women's work, in our research. We understood unpaid care work to mean direct care of people, that is the physical care of looking after children, the elderly, disabled, ill, and so on, as well as the indirect care of people through cooking, cleaning, shopping for household goods. We also included some other aspects of the broader category of unpaid work, such as collection of water, fuel, fodder for own consumption, as we saw these as integral components of care work, women's care work. Just briefly, the research was a cross-country comparative research project funded by IDRC, DFID, and Hewlett Foundation. It was carried out in 4 countries, but here I'd just like to focus on the findings from our India leg of the research, where we also, because of the project's focus on women's economic empowerment policies and programs, we looked at 2 women's economic empowerment programs, which was Lekha in Rajasthan and Seva's work in MP. Our research was mixed method. Sorry, I'm rushing through this because I really have so little time, and I want to focus on some of the findings. The research was mixed methods. It included time use survey administered to 200 women across the 4 sites. All of these women were in paid work and with a child under 6. Again, I won't dwell on the detailed findings of the research, except to make a couple of points. Firstly, in both the predominantly Dalit and Adivasi bastis of our urban sites and the Adivasi villages of our rural sites, women were engaged in arduous, back-breaking work characterized by low returns, seasonality. Women usually had more than one type of job through the year. They worked as daily wage agricultural laborers, as Manrega workers, home-based workers, street vendors, domestic workers in construction work, brick kiln work, and other forms of self-employment. Again, as several studies have shown, our research too found that much of the paid work that women engaged in was work that enabled them to continue performing their unpaid care work. This work was work that provided them with flexibility in terms of either time spent on work, location and distance from home, or both, typified by home-based work, though this was not across the board. Further, participation in paid work was dependent on the intensity of care work responsibilities, as well as support for care. And this is borne out by macro data too, which finds that there is a dip in already low women's workforce participation rates for women with young children. However, where women had no means of support for childcare and had no choice but to work, they had their children accompany them to work, sometimes with an older sibling to watch over them. On unpaid care work, as several other studies have found, our research too found that this work was largely a familial and female responsibility, in that it was largely performed by women, supported by other women and girls of the household. Men's participation in care work was sporadic and intermittent, performed mainly when women were ill, menstruating, or away, and no other female was present in the household. Men, however, had relatively higher levels of participation in childcare. Now, we found that there were several factors that influence the social organization of care and the intensity of women's care burdens. These include the structure of the family, whether it was nuclear or extended, the size of the family, its gender composition, life cycle factors or life crises, for instance, pregnancy or birth of a child or an illness in the family or death of a family member, affected the social organization and acuity and intensity of women's care burdens. Again, seasonality, agricultural seasons, summer, then the availability and accessibility of public infrastructure, resources, and services, including water, fuel, sanitation, roads, transport, health services, schools, anganwadis, all of these affected the acuity and intensity of women's care burdens. The thing to note about both the paid work and the unpaid care work that women perform is that while women and members of their households expressed both ambiguity towards and a recognition of its necessity and value, much of the paid and unpaid work was experienced by women as physically and mentally arduous and depleting. This was especially the case for some kind of tasks, and I can go into detail later when we have questions. So the question for us then is, how were women balancing their paid work and care work responsibilities? What factors enable them to find a better balance between their paid work and unpaid work? Our findings were that more often than not, women were in fact not able to balance their double burdens. While women were able to achieve a better balance in some contexts, and not always great contexts, because this was when support for their care work was performed mainly by other women in the household or other girls. So there was no real redistribution of care work. Or there was better availability of and access to resources and services to a very limited extent. For instance, through taps in homes or piped water or anganwadis in the neighborhood. Or when they were doing income generating work inside the home, again, not ideal. We don't want to get women back into only performing home-based works. But these were some of the contexts within which women were able to achieve a better balance. But the overwhelming story across the board was that in the main, women's unpaid care work did not shift while they were in paid work. They were not able to reduce or redistribute their unpaid care work in any significant way. Instead, women stretched their time and energy to manage their responsibilities, multitasked. They juggled their many roles and responsibilities. They postponed some work by a day or two, but there were too many tasks such as cooking, caring for children that had to be done every day, irrespective of how tired or rushed they were. And the important thing to note is this had several deleterious effects and fallouts on their own physical and mental well-being, their paid work, and on the well-being of their children. Women experienced chronic physical fatigue, chronic deficits of rest, a lack of uninterrupted sleep, mental exhaustion, depletion of their physical and emotional well-being. Our research was littered with terms like thakan, tension, bhakti, that women use to speak of the effects of the imbalance between paid work and unpaid work on their lives. So then how is public policy to deal with this imbalance? What would work-life balance look like for women in such vulnerable and precarious contexts? The first thing to note is that there is no policy that specifically focuses on unpaid care work in women. In other words, there is no holistic focus on recognizing, reducing, and redistributing unpaid care work in Diane Elson's formulation. And her formulation, Sahara Razavi, why do we want this redistribution across the care diamond? What we want a fairer redistribution across the care diamond, family, community, market, and state. But our policies do not have a holistic focus on either recognition or reducing or redistribution. I mean, I agree with Professor Lekha that it is great that the time use survey is being updated. That is definitely one way of recognizing women's unpaid care work. But overall, policy on unpaid care work is patchy and piecemeal. And mainly, as Rajani Palriwala and Meeta have argued, the regime of care provisioning is framed by an ideology of gendered, stratified familialism. That is, care work is a private responsibility, it's women's responsibility, and it is embedded in familial relations. Moreover, it's stratified across caste and other social cleavages, both in terms of who gets care work support in their houses as well as who performs such care work. Of course, there have been incursions made to this ideology over the years, which are important but insufficient. So we have the employer-focused provisioning of childcare and maternity benefits, for instance, through the Factories Act and the recently amended Maternity Benefits Act. Then we have the public provisioning of maternity benefits and childcare, for instance, through the which under which the central scheme notified is the Pradhan Mantri Matru Vandana Yojana. We also have, under the Unorganized Social Sector Workers Social Security Act, we have a scheme of the Janani Suraksha Yojana, and then, of course, childcare through the ICDS, though this provisioning is not based on any understanding of providing women or families support for their unpaid care work responsibilities. There's others too. There's the Rajiv Gandhi Creche scheme, the Narega Creche mandate, a wider gamut of patchy social security provisioning policies on water, energy, health, and so on, all of which have a bearing on unpaid care work. But important to note is that our research found that recognizing, reducing, and redistributing employment alone is insufficient to address the physical and emotional depletion experienced by women. It has to be accompanied by the provisioning of decent work that provides a living wage, where conditions of work are regulated, and which provide a right to social security. Now, of course, the government had an opportunity, because I don't know, the Rajya Sabha has probably passed all of the codes as we speak, or is in the process of passing the codes on labor codes I'm talking about. So one of the labor codes, the code on wages, was already passed into law last year, and the other three are being rushed through while the opposition is on strike. But if the latest versions of the proposed codes are any indication, informal women workers don't stand to gain from these legislations. For instance, the Code on Occupational Health and Safety completely excludes women in the informal sector from its purview. Similarly, the Code on Social Security is a far cry even from previous versions of the code, which recognize the right to social security through the progressive universalization of social security. I mean, there's a lot more we can discuss, but overall, I just wanted to say that there is indeed a long way to go for public policy in India to truly provide women from low-income households any semblance of a work-life balance. I leave it here, and I wait the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Shraddha. You've given us a lot to think about. Yeah, and I'm actually slightly stumped at the moment. You've given me so much to think about now, but I hope we can come back and sort of reconnect and go over a lot of this in part 2 of our discussion. Now I'll call upon Rajani Seshadri to speak to us about challenges with care work faced by women in the IT sector and other formal economy jobs. And I think this will kind of place the formal, informal, but work as paid and unpaid also on the table.
Thank you, Archana. So let me ask the traditional Zoom question. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay, thank you. So to set the context, while Archana has done a very generous introduction of mine, I want to tell you all that unlike most of you, I'm not from the area of public policy. I'm a practitioner who's worked in the IT services industry for over 30 years now. And my observations are primarily from what I have experienced as a business leader and later as an executive coach as well. So with that in mind, I hope you will understand that my knowledge is very different from that of Shraddha's. So I believe that whatever we set out to do, social change is probably going to be the one thing that makes a big difference to women in the formal economy. And what do I mean by social change? It is that we raise our girls and our boys to believe that childcare, family care, managing a home, all of these are responsibilities that women must assume. And most women, because of that conditioning, because of that cultural conditioning, they assume it automatically. There are very few women who say, hey, you know what, I don't want to do this. This is not my responsibility alone. If we are going to have a child, the child has two parents, and both of us are equally responsible for the well being of the child. Both of us live in this household, so we are equally responsible for the well being of the household. Very rarely does that happen, and I believe that this is because of the cultural conditioning that we give our children. This becomes institutionalized in every single partnership. So today, when I speak to women who are working from home during the pandemic, uh, most of them are saying, how do I find the mental time to focus on work? I'm expected to contribute as much as I ever did when I was in a different environment, when I could focus purely on work, and when I was not torn by multiple priorities and responsibilities of home, family, childcare, and elder care, and patient care in case somebody in the family is affected by COVID. So there is an automatic assumption of responsibilities that most women make, regardless of whether they are, how educated they are, how well placed they are in a professional scenario. I also believe that a part of this same cultural conditioning is that we breed. I'm sorry, is there a problem with my voice? So, I believe that this same cultural conditioning also plays a role in a lack of career intentionality that we breed into our girls. We do not raise them with the belief that their career is um, primary to their well being, contributing to the financial wellness of the family gives them a certain power in the household. We do not bring these thoughts into their um, upbringing. A woman's career is in the formal economy. I'm talking about a woman's career is always at the second place. Her income is always or very often a second income, and therefore is not considered as essential as that of her male partner. This lack of career intentionality also leads to a lack of career planning. Do, what will I do if I am a trailing spouse? What will I do when I am responsible for childcare? How many women do we see who think about these points before they marry or before they have a child, before they assume the responsibilities of a whole bunch of people over and above themselves? If there is a reasonable family income and financial need is not a driver for a woman, it's just so much easier to step away from a job that not only requires long hours at the workplace, but also has a 24/7 electronic tether, if you will, and an expectation that she will invest her own personal time on continuous learning. There's just not enough hours in the day. And it's much easier for women to say, I cannot give away my care responsibilities. There is no one else to do them, or those are my primary responsibilities. And I this is the only thing I can give up. So many of them their career takes a backseat, and very often they quit. So I'm going to stop here with a quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the American Supreme Court judge who recently passed away. She said in 2001, women will have achieved true equality when men share with them the responsibility of bringing up the next generation. So, with that, I will stop. And Archana, I'm happy to take questions when it's time for them.
Thank you, Rajani, for sharing everything you did. Also gives us more things to think about, and I think as I'm listening to all of you, I see so many threads that we should talk about very soon. I'll move on now to the last speaker of the day. She has, in fact, sent us a 10-minute video.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this forum. It's a pleasure to be here amongst such eminent experts, and it's wonderful to be here discussing the very key issue of the hidden labor of women. And I wear three hats, so my opening remarks will include all three: leadership, education, and economics. So let's start with leadership. While women are trained for leadership, as I was, their opportunities for leadership are stunted at the workplace. Or would we not see more CEOs? Would we not see more women on boards? Worldwide, most countries have had to have a women's quota for boardrooms. And this is an embarrassment to qualified professional women worldwide. I personally do not want to be a quota candidate. I know a former colleague who refuses to be within the quota invite to corporate boards, but will happily join as the third female member. We have the fact that we have had to seek leadership by numbers should embarrass men, for it is their manspreading that makes us have to push and nudge everyone. And the fault lies with the pipeline. The pipeline is at fault. So not only do fewer Indian women join the workplace, our numbers are dropping, in fact, even fewer remain in the workplace by the time they reach middle management level. Why is that? Because of the push and pull factors. Workplaces are not designed around the life cycle of women, and the hidden labor imposed upon them for marriage, childbirth, and indeed nurturing makes it a heavy load. Neither are home spaces that pull women into doing more than their fair share. So if everything is designed in the shape of men, then how will women fit? Let's talk about the pull factors. One is, of course, our conditioning. Second, the service level expectations from women. Men don't have to meet those standards. And third, what I call the void. The grand void between what women see in front of them, let's say a basket of laundry that needs to be done, and see that as an actionable, versus men who look at the same basket of laundry and can see nothing that needs to be done over there. And that, of course, has to do with the fact that women have been trained, whereas poor men have been left untrained to actually do the work that sustains their life and makes it worth living. Push factors in the corporate space, in the workspaces, are immense. Organization design, for one. Organization design is linear. Its progression pathways are linear. Life, not just for women, for men also, life is not linear. There are penalties for breaks. That makes no sense. Every human being needs breaks, not just for childbirth or nurturing a child. Lack of flexible or work from home arrangements. And we have COVID to thank right now for proving the success, or at least partial success, contextual success of work from home arrangements, of different ways of looking at the workplace. In the midst of this horrible gray cloud, we have the silver lining that comes as proof that different ways of working can work. The bro code where mentoring and team plays happen. And the bro code being seen as the pro code. This is what professionalism looks like. If you behave like men, you look professional. Using deeper voices rather than higher pitched voices is a simple and small example. Dressing, wearing a coat is another example. Another final point Demonstrating and being visible as a leader is very tough. And I have to share a short story over here from 27 years ago. This was for the interview for my business school. There was a group discussion, 10 people. 7 of the 10 were hostel mates from one specific engineering college. Of the 10, I was the only female in the room. I had to demonstrate leadership, or there was no way I was going to make it to that campus. There was no way I was going to make it to my ideal B school. What did I do? I had to put in the extra work to read super fast, to analyze super fast, to collate super fast, and to have my talking point super fast. So the minute the professor organizer said, go, it was literally like a race, and I was first off the mark. I was therefore marked down as somebody who has no problem being first, and therefore no problem being a leader. You have to put in that extra work. Why should we have to put in that extra work? The men didn't have to do that. I think there's a lot to be said about the way we organize our work lives. But the second hat, let me put on. Education. The story in education is known, as is the impact of the pandemic on the gender bias in education. Women drop out earlier than men. Girls go to government schools, boys go to private schools. Girls are trained for their vocation and for school work. Boys are trained to go out and maybe will work eventually. The key to this is girls are trained to operate indoors, boys are trained to work outdoors, which is as old as the Neanderthals. Many countries have overcome this, even ones with Neanderthals in their history. And let us look to Scandinavia. They did it with a will, with self-interest at heart, with community, and with cognitively adapted content in education. You have to think it through and you have to make it work. It starts young, this with lower expectations of women. We have seen it in textbooks, and now we see it online where AI-driven systems show the same bias. They will show a nurse as female and a doctor as female. It will show a pilot as male, a flight attendant as female. We will learn that farmers are men, that inventors are men, that bankers are men. I have been all. We will learn that women do not even make it to the pictures. So how can they make it in life? Not only is their labor hidden, their achievements, very often their titles are hidden from view and handed over to men. So where are the role models? And what do the models that are visible in sight teach us? It's changing, sure, but very, very, very slightly, not enough. So I have a technique that I ask teachers to do. I ask teachers to read stories and curriculum chapters with the genders swapped. If the main character was of the other gender, how would the story read? What changes? It's often very illuminating and it opens windows. Go on. Try Cinderella as a man and the prince as a woman in that same storyline. Try swapping over Red Riding Hood and Robin Hood. My third hat is that of economics. The challenge here is that of valuing the hidden labor of women. And the challenge is bigger than it looks. One can simplistically say, taking the big picture, that half the population is women. Women's work is the same as men. And so we can double our GDP by imputing the value of women's hidden labor. Let's make it even better. Adjust this again by the fact that for every 100 rupees or $100 paid to men, women are paid about 70 at best. So impute and adjust that in your calculation. And you will see the GDP rankings of the world turn upside down instantly. I mean, you'll see India rise to the top of the league tables by size of economy. Heck, let's do one more adjustment in this calculation. If we remember that women work more hours, more than double the hours of men, what's the number? 8 to 10 hours of paid work, and then they come home and do another shift of work. So that's another 8 to 10 hours, right? Adjust that, bring that in. One more adjustment. For every 52 minutes of work that men do, women do in the different studies, 300% to 577% more housework, right? So that is 1:7 times more housework. So let's add that housework into the calculation. Imputing the value of work, adding the extra, India will be a $5 trillion economy in no time at all, just by valuing the work that women do. This is half joking, of course, because it's not as easy as it looks. We know that this is number jugglery. because it does not give women relief or rights or even dignity. If all the work of mothers and carers is measured at the replacement cost of tasks, then where does it leave the mother or the carer? The homemaker is not an aggregate of help services. There is more to it, we know. Does one value the work of women? How does one value this? Does one value the work of women at home at the cost of replacement? Then what happens about the quality of care, attention to detail, the extra love, the customization for every family member, the therapeutic conversations that you have, the comforting silences at the right time? How do you measure and value all of those things? That is also hidden work. There is a lot of emotional energy, a lot of emotional labor that is expended by women in making sure that the household functions smoothly and that every person in the household is working to their best potential. Of course, some men would also do that. Not all men, not all women, of course. Let's talk about another way of valuing. Does one value it at opportunity cost? Based on what? Their degree? So the starting salary for their whole life? Or what they would have progressed to with promotions? What is the valuation there? What about those without degrees? Do we recognize their resource management skills, their organizational skills, their leadership skills, their public relations skills? They manage all the parties and the social life, right? And how do we value them? Just like venture capitalists? How many, what do you think will happen? How many homemakers will get unicorn valuations worth multiples of what they save and what they make? This is not easy arithmetic because this discussion is not about valuation. It is about values. So I thank you for inviting me to this conversation. And I look forward to hearing everybody's inputs and having a fairly rigorous discussion going forward. Thank you.
Thank you for the video, Meeta. It was lovely to both watch you and see you on screen. So that's quite lovely. That brings us to part 2 of today's discussion, where I'm hoping all of you, the panelists, will be able to respond to each other and take off from what each other has said. I just have some very initial sort of questions that may connect some threads. And if you want to touch upon those, feel free to. But otherwise, if you want to respond to each other in any other way, please feel free to do that as well. So some questions I had were when I heard Rajani and Meeta speak about leadership in workspaces, was also me thinking about what leadership in the informal economy looks like. We have movements, we have unions, we have labor organizations. And Shraddha, I was wondering if you wanted to come in and talk about what leadership in the informal sector looks like, and what having leadership positions in the informal sector looks like for adding more work to women's plates. We were also talking about work from home. And I think COVID has made a distinction between what it was like before and after. And I think before COVID, it was gendered in the sense that more women needed to work from home to balance different kinds of work. But has the post-COVID situation made this any better or any different, considering, like Rajani said, women's work and career is anyway seen as supplementary and secondary? So then does working from home often end up in you're anyway not really doing work, so then there's so much more that you should be doing around the house? So that was another thing. Shraddha gave us such an extensive background about the project she's been on. And I think the keywords from that for me really were recognize, recognize and redistribute and reduce care work. So when we're talking recognize, how does what Meeta talk about education and Shraddha talk about recognize, how do they overlap? And we are saying recognize, redistribute and reduce, how does Lekha talking about policy come in? Because I think both Lekha and Shraddha had quite a bit of an overlap with respect to health and what that means. So these are just some initial thoughts. Feel free to respond to these or anything else that you want to respond to.
Hi. Archana, shall I go? Because you asked me first the question on leadership in the informal.
Of course, go ahead.
I don't know if I'm audible because I got some messages which I belatedly looked at that maybe I'm not very audible.
I
Archana,
think your mic may maybe could you increase the volume on your mic? We're able to hear you clearly, but the volume is very low.
Okay, it's as high as it can go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I think it is really interesting, bringing up leadership. I would look at it in terms of what you said, really, which is on the power of organizing and the power of unions. And of course, one of the projects, one of the programs that we did look at was on the Self-Employed Women's Association and their organizing in Madhya Pradesh. And we did find that the longer uh, that women were associated with organizations such as SEMA, they were able to first of all have a better better pride in their work. Their economic conditions also improved, say through, for instance, the economic conditions improved because they got like financial loans. So somebody who was in laying bricks became a mason. There were ways in which they also had progress in their work. But we also found that that did not necessarily shift the unpaid care work. In fact, what happened was the older they got support from their daughters-in-law and other women in the household. But so, in a broader sense, it did not redistribute across, across the care diamond in a sense, or especially within the household. Those kind of changes didn't happen. But definitely, the power of organizing very much had a very significant role to play in women recognizing the value of their own work. And I think that is kind of at the heart of this recognition, redistribution, reduction, not just of unpaid care work, but also of, not, yeah, but also in how it relates to paid work. I'll stop here for now. I'm sure others have something to say, and I'll come back.
Okay, great. This part,
Archana, I can go
this
next.
part of the panel is meant to be unmoderated, so I'll let the four of you sort of chat with each other, and I'm just going to keep time in this part of the in this part of the discussion.
So, Archana, I will go next. I'm always a bit nervous when talking to a panel of this kind because what do women in the formal economy have to complain about? Food, shelter is taken care of. So, when I compare what women in the formal economy go through against what Shraddha is talking about, it feels like you don't know how good you have it, right? All of us. The problem is that we've never experienced being in the informal economy, and therefore it's very hard to empathize and very hard to say, hey, I have it good, right? While we might acknowledge that in moments, uh, in general, we are just looking at the tedium that accompanies care work and the lack of respect, the lack of recognition, and the lack of appreciation that care work um, gets. And if when I choose to build a career, am I willing to take leadership for myself? You talked about leadership. So the question I often wonder about is that am I willing to lead myself and to stand up for myself, to speak up for myself, and therefore create an environment where my work is recognized, whether it's care work, whether it is uh, a career, whether it's a professional work, and therefore, why are we not teaching our girls leadership skills while they are still under the age of 10? And very often it is, we seem to delight in um, girls who don't speak up, the modest, the Cinderella types, as Meeta said. And I dislike Disney because it sets the tone that someday my prince will come. No, I want to be the prince. How do we make our girl children think about being the prince? Where are we falling behind in building leadership skills among our girl children? Meeta, your take on that?
Very beautifully phrased question. Beautifully phrased question, and I really like the way you offer up the entire spectrum of the underprivileged to the superprivileged, because there is a whole range of issues at every point in that spectrum, and it plays out differently, and each time it plays out as a form of respect. And respect at one and if we play the respect conversation, it is about receiving and giving respect, whether it plays out as somebody being beaten up, or it plays out as somebody being paid enough, or whether it plays out as being taught the right things at school, including leadership, which was the one that you pinpointed. And I truly believe that women are still not taught to hold their own in the formal education system. Though culturally, you will find certain pockets where women have been able to and have been trained by other women to hold their own. And I think we do not tell these stories enough. As an educational tool, and this is why I picked up on stories. We are often creatures, in fact, all of us are creatures of our priors, depending upon our prior experience, depending upon our prior reading, writing, learning, what the stories that we've been told, the experiences of our seniors, peers, and people around us, etc. And our priors are formed basically by stories. And we, as are still allowing the old stories to formulate current students' realities. The day we are able to change the stories, we would have changed the next generation, which is why I find it completely unacceptable for a chapter to talk about a specific, whatever, postman. And this is why I refer to two or three examples. But you are absolutely right. I agree with you that we need to be able to train our students in leadership. And how do we do that? How do we do that? The question is always how. We know what needs to be done. The question is how. And is there a chance, or is there a structural way of, or at least a consistent way of ensuring that women emerge as leaders, as lifelong learners? Given the fact that we really haven't been able to do much at school, I also want to bring in the lifelong learning perspective. Is it possible for us to create leadership opportunities in informal circumstances? So, for example, I find the leadership opportunities given by the weekly satsang that is conducted in North India. I do not know if you have an equivalent in South India, but in North India, I grew up with every week, twice or thrice a week, somebody would be hosting the neighborhood, the extended neighborhood. And that is an act of leadership. Somebody would be singing the songs. That's an act of leadership. Somebody would be, as a part of the community, would be reading out the chapter and verse or whatever. And we have informal structures that enable leadership, but we do not extend them to children, and we do not extend them to other domains other than religion. At least I have not seen it outside of a religious context. So I would really love to hear from all of you how we can extend this leadership / respect. I see them as very connected to each other in other informal settings, because you absolutely rightly said, the more you do it, the more comfortable you are it, and the more you can in it, and the more you can exercise it. I'd love to hear more.
I just thought, just to get back to the question of leadership and how we might think about it in the informal context, I think first and foremost, we have to think of the structural kind of issues that upon which, I mean, much of the work that women perform in the informal sector, I mean, the context of that, we have to put that in the center of the conversation. I mean, for me, again, without the fundamental aspect, the value of women's work, both in the paid sector as well as in the unpaid economy, without centering the value of it. And I think Meeta talked about this quite extensively. How do we value it, and what are the ways in which we value it in the macroeconomic context? But I think it is in the everyday sense too, about the value that women bring to, performing care work, but also domestic work. And this is where I also want to speak to Ranjani's, how do we talk across sectors? I think there is a relationship between the informal and the formal sector, which is that through, say, for instance, paid domestic work, there are ways in which women in the formal sector, so to speak, are enabled to perform work because of the paid domestic work performed by other women who are disadvantaged. And so I think in order to transform, all of us experience gender norms in how our work is valued. But there are ways in which we can see that there are also stratifications between women and divisions in terms of which are of disadvantage, which are of caste, which are of class, which are of precarity. And I think if we are to kind of transform the gender division of labor, it has to be for everybody. But what are the ways in which that can happen? Is it through valuing paid domestic work more, paying domestic workers better? What would that then do to the relationship within a middle class household? All of these are questions. How does that then transform that relationship? And what does it do to the gender division of labor there? So yeah.
Lekha, would you possibly want to respond here?
Thank you. I was listening carefully to Meeta, and hi, Meeta. This is first time you're on panel, and I know her from Twitter. So it's lovely. And I was listening to all these points about the value, about the stories, how we can bring them on board to the policymaker in a language which they understand. Because, when we talk about the public policy, especially when we speak to finance minister or when we speak to RBI governor, the importance of incorporating the development agendas in the framework. It's not only economic growth, which is of a focus, but the development agenda in which the fastest and the sharpest way of an economic growth is, as Meeta rightly pointed out, you incorporate the women's potential. And where are these efficient women? What's happening to them? What's that public policy space, or what is that space we need to provide them, so that we don't lose their insights, we don't lose these talents. So that question, it's really thought provoking. And as a policy maker, it's very tough to articulate in terms of stories, in terms of values, because the moment we speak to a finance minister, I don't know about Nirmala Sitharaman, she may look for a number. So what is that number you're talking about? And of course, Meeta has given a little bit of hint over there that how can we, do the valuation from the values, she was rightly, taking the debate forward to the valuation. So the moment we talk about the valuing the women's unpaid work, and, there are many things like opportunity cost, or you try to impute the market wage to the work done at home. And, there are many things. But The important recognition that has happened in the policy space is in 1993, Systems of National Accounts. They have extended what is called the prediction boundary and incorporated this invisible women's work into that. But of course, we have not counted into GDP to call that GDP will go by some $1 trillion up, but we kept it as satellite accounts. So that one can appreciate that in terms of policy making, where we can integrate the stories or the values in terms of the valuation. So that was the first step. The second step is, many things we do, it cannot be called as an economic activity. The moment it is not an economic activity, we cannot value that. But the women invisibly doing economic activity at home, which is unmonetized, that needs to be valued. So these are the questions. Like, we can categorize our 24 hours chronology of the time. If we as women, if we keep the time diary, we can say that 8 hours we go out and work, and that's getting into the GDP of our country. But 24 minus 8 hours, if the government is not focusing, if the public policy is not focusing on the efficiency and the utilization of the time and resources in this 24 minus 8 hours, what's happening at the individual or the household or the non-monetized sector, then our economic well-being or the welfare of the nation is only partial. So what I'm thinking is that kind of a lens by a policy maker to give equal importance to what is happening at the paid sector and what is happening at the unpaid care economy sector is not equal, then we are not going to have our economic well-being in the highest swing policy possible. And it is very easy now. It's very normal now, I felt, when the other panelists talk about it with so much of dignity and recognition on the topic right now. Because in 2000, when we began, this vocabulary, this articulation of the subject care, in the finance ministry, I'm working in the Public Finance Institute. It was very tough, but over the years now it may look normal, because I am seeing the new IMF managing director's blog is on care economy. So the world has changed and it started. But in 2000, when gender budgeting as a pioneer study, when we were doing it in IPFP, as Shraddha pointed out about the Diane Nelson, their framework of care economy, we could not. It was very tough. So over the years, what has happened in the policy framework, things have moved, things have changed, but integrating into the macro policy framework, that's still remaining very tough, because it has to come up as a specific policy tool, as the existing macroeconomic framework is very much rule based, and we have to deal with many other strict constraints about the fiscal deficit or whatever it is, but it has to come up as a specific policy tool. So this is what I thought, that what we policymakers, in coordination and conversation with the civil society, with the other stakeholders, what we need to take forward in our country.
May I come in for a second, Archanaa?
Of course.
Thank you. And hello, Lekha. Wonderful to finally talk to you.
Hi. Yeah.
Yes, you said this so very beautifully. And in the chat window, I see a question about, or a discussion about, a story of stolen labor. And you're absolutely right. We have some very rigorous mathematical tools. In two things you talked about. One, you talked about language, and two, you talked about math. You're absolutely right on both counts, because how does one translate? I mean, we finally discovered the term care economy, but there is so much more to what women do. And there was a picture doing the rounds that had gone viral of a construction worker, a lady who was standing with her back to the camera, and she was loading bricks onto her head. And on her back, there was a sling in which there was a baby, a tiny baby. Now, is that the care economy? And how does one translate just the sheer immensity of what that lady is doing in that moment? There are just so many dimensions to what she is achieving in that moment. I do not think we even have the language to translate into either development speak. Maybe there is for some parts of development speak, but certainly not into policy speak. So our question as policymakers or policy observers is, who is responsible or who will take on the task of creating that language, that translating bridge. The second thing that you talked about was the mathematics of it. I mean, absolutely true. Rigorous mathematics does not allow for multiplicity, does not allow for, again, you're talking about the care that bit that has been measured. But there are other parts of the math that think of women's work as a cost, for example. Whereas GDP, etc., calculations are clearly either on revenue or definitely an aggregate of value add. So making that value add visible, again, finding the language to make that mathematics of value add visible is a whole other arena of work that all of us need to pitch in, because this is where I would call for a multidisciplinary lens to it. A single development lens or a single feminist lens is, or a single policy lens, or even a national income accounting lens is not going to do it alone. And I again, I ask, put the question out to all of you, wise people, as to how to translate that language and mathematics into something that becomes even visible and possible for policymakers.
Just to say here that there already has been a lot of work done by feminist groups. There's a campaign for maternity entitlements, which is part of working group of the right to food. There are a whole bunch of groups on early childhood care and development. So I think there is a whole bunch of work that has already, I mean, historically gone on in the country trying to account for women's unpaid care work. One is, of course, through labor legislations and saying, when women are working as well as men, of course, it's never gender neutral, all of these policies, they aim at women. But we could actually ideally think of, if we want to transform the gender division of labor, we don't want gender neutral policies so that the gender division of labor might be transformed. But historically, labor law policies in the formal sector have tried to kind of somehow at least give respite to women through maternity benefits, through leave. That is one component, but there's also childcare provisioning, for instance, under the Factories Act. Or if you think of public sector provisioning, then of course there's under the labor itself, you're supposed to provide creche for when five children are below the age of 5 are accompanying their mothers to work. So there are many ways in which public policy has sought to address the question of women's unpaid work through legislations, but also citizenship-focused right to social security. So that, in the sense that you're not only thinking about women, because the whole problem has been that women in the informal economy have the benefits of labor laws. So then you are wanting to think about what other mechanisms, and there's a lot of work going on in relation to construction work, domestic work, about models and how you can have an insurance-based schemes where, for instance, the employer, the state, as well as the employee contributes to actualize the right to social security, say, for instance, domestic workers. So I think there has been some thinking already there that we can draw on to think about how public policy might address unpaid care work. But that is only a minuscule component of it, right? We all know that childcare is insufficient, maternity benefits are insufficient. We have to think about infrastructure for instance, roads, all of it that make women time poor and time stressed and depleted physically, emotionally, all of that. There are so many other aspects of public policies on water, ensuring that women have piped water coming to their doorstep. All of that, fuel, health, of course, education through Anganwadis. I mean, the ICDS system is one of the world's biggest provider of childcare, and yet it does not center women's work in its understanding. Because if it did, then it would start thinking about flexible timings of ICDS, which some states do. But it would also start thinking about extending work hours, for instance, and not keeping it to a few hours of the day when women can send their kids to the Anganwadi. So there are many ways in which I think public policy can address women's
Archana, if I may come in here.
already a lot of work on it.
Oh, sorry, Shraddha, I didn't realize.
No, I
Okay, so I was just listening to Lekha and Meeta and Shraddha, and I'm just wondering, why is it that when India had such a high intensity, high visibility family planning program in the 70s and 80s, not counting Sanjay Gandhi, right? I'm still talking about where we started with Hum Do Hamare Do, and I remember that I was in hospital after I had my child, and there was this um, public education program through songs. And to translate from Tamil, it was that when my father was asked to create a family, he actually went and created a village, right? So it was a very high intensity, high visibility, highly vocal family planning program. What prevents our policymakers from doing something similar to improve the status of the girl child and thereon, all the stuff that we talked about, education, leadership, respect, recognition, all of that? Is that something that we can push for in the policy language?
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Rajani, for that wonderful question. Can I go ahead, Archana?
Of course, yes.
Yeah,
We have
and
we have about 5 to 7 more minutes for this discussion before we take audience questions. So
absolutely. Yeah. So a quick response to Rajani's point. Like she was asking that how we can integrate the concerns into the policy making in terms of, one thing which came to me immediately is regarding the Finance Commission's role. There was a huge issue from the South Indian states and other states which they have controlled the population. They have sent their girls to the schools. They controlled the population. But the moment you are deciding on the intergovernmental transfer for the state, if you are using the population as a criteria, the states in which they control the population, they are going to miss the bus or they are going to get less money. So how we can address this issue? So in the interim report of the 15th Finance Commission, they submitted in November, they integrated a criteria in the tax transfer formula, and that criteria was the total fertility rate. So the moment, it looked very weird that what a finance commission is going to take a decision about a woman's fertility, this thing, it was a huge thing. Like people started looking at it from the feminist perspective and why this TFR is there. But they have proxied TFR as a criteria for the demographic performance of a state and how we can, induce money based on the demographic performance. So, but it's again an intra-household question, and the total fertility rate, that construct or that variable is not just coming out of blue or anything. But as you rightly pointed out, our country, Rajani, our country's problem, as you rightly pointed out, it's a 0 to 6x ratio is very adverse. What is happening to the women or the girls? The discrimination here is starting before birth. So those kind of aspects in which when the sex ratio is depleted, what kind of policy making we can do to arrest this? Of course, the legal fiat has to work in the legislations, but from the public policy, from the fiscal point of view, from the financial point of view, because money speaks. So what kind of thing we can, as a policy maker, respond to the situation? And if we can integrate the 0 to 6 into the Finance Commission formula, the states in which the sex ratio, juvenile sex ratio is adverse, they may not get the intended money. They may get less. So these kind of, recognizing the issues by the top decision making bodies. That could be, and it's like symbolizing, or it could be an eye opening thing for the states and the center to work together towards the gender equality goals. So this is a quick response. I thought that we cannot say no, and we cannot sit holier than thou. These are just intra-household decision process. No, the public policy has got a role to play if such kind of discrimination even before birth is happening in our country. So this is a quick example that came to my mind. Thank you, Rajani, for that question.
Shraddha, Rajani, Meeta, Lekha, if you want to do just another quick round of responses, that's okay. Otherwise, I'm happy to move on to audience questions. We have a bunch of questions coming up, so I think we'll have to spend quite some time on them. Shall I start with the questions?
Sure.
Meeta, there's one question specifically for you on schools and how schools regulate women's productive employment. And any thoughts on that?
From what I understand of the question, there are of course 2 or 3 ways it depends upon the context of the school. So there are 2 or 3 ways of approaching it. I'm going to actually talk about something that is, and I know Rajani, you talked about the informal context and the village context, and I would like to go back to that. But the context that is more familiar to us personally is the city school, and the city school sadly does definitely undermine the work of women outside of the home space. I think working women are actively discouraged. Parent-teacher meetings, and this goes out to government schools in urban areas as well. Parent-teacher meetings find teachers who themselves are sitting there on a Saturday and working. They find themselves completely discouraging women from going into the area of work. The kind of pressure that comes to mothers via their schools and via their children for mothers to stay at home and not work. And this is not about silly coffee mornings or the elite, but it is the work of being a co-teacher is being handed over to mothers. It is not seen as a parenting task. It is not seen as an inadequacy of teaching. It is not seen as a gap in having teacher assistants at schools. Most other countries have teachers and teaching assistants, so we do not have that at school. It is not seen as a gap in remedial work and attention at school. It is seen as your mummy should have taught you that, literally that. And this goes across income ranges. And I'm talking more about the urban spaces now and less about the rural spaces. I acknowledge that. And this mummy as a co-teacher is something that is being reinforced in times of online learning crisis, in times of COVID, where the technology part of it is being seen by daddy and the homework and the learning part of it is being seen by mummy. Again, very gendered responses to how online learning is happening wherever it is happening. There's a gendered response, of course, in areas where the internet is not available except via the cell phone, because again, men have more access to cell phones. So getting the phone off your father for learning purposes, that's a whole other conversation. I'm acknowledging that as a conversation, but not engaging with it right now. But I think you're very right to point that out. And I find it amazing that the same thinking, I'm going to extend this, has been extended to the Maternity Act, just because, Shraddha, you mentioned the Maternity Act. And I see a commonality in terms of the value that drives both approaches. The Maternity Act that gave 6 months leave to women, in my opinion, should have acknowledged the fact that parenting and teaching or co-teaching is a family matter. It is not for the mother to do. And therefore, family leave at that point of time would have been a much more fair thing to do. In bringing in the parent as a co-teacher should again be a family matter, and it's not about the mother at all. And these are conversations that we should be having loudly and clearly. And as a couple of policy gurus taught me again and again and again and again. So policy gurus have taught me that if you say something 7 times, you will be heard once. So I think this is probably the one of the third or fourth times where we are beginning. I mean, I would count this as 3 or 4 in the count to articulating it. But I think the whole parent as a co-teacher conversation is bubbling over because of online learning, and it's time that most of us stepped up and said, let's actually define what you mean by a co-teacher, and let it not fall onto mummy roles at all, because mummy has other things to do.
And to take on from that, Meeta, one of the things that I hear women saying is, "Hey, you know what? Can we talk after 11:30? Because my son is using my laptop and my daughter is using my cell phone to attend uh, school classes."
There you
So
go.
why isn't it the daddy's laptop or the iPad or the phone that's going to the child, and it's the mummy's devices that are being taken over, so that she is left with no way to communicate, right? And I also believe that if women worked outside the home in the formal economy, I'm talking about again urban, what I heard described as India 1, India 2, and Bharat 1. If the women worked outside their home, they would also stand up for themselves and say, you know what, my work is important too, or my work is as important as anybody else's work, and you shall not touch my laptop, right? But when it's always, what do you have to do? You can wait, right? That mummy is never going to have um, her own space and her own flexibility to do the things that she needs to do or even wants to do. So the
Thank
conversation that you're talking about, Meeta, I agree with you, and I strongly believe that it should start with girls and boys in primary school.
And I think it's time to emphasize that we can actually have this conversation right now. Because of online learning, we have an opportunity over the next 6 weeks in a way we haven't had this kind of an opportunity ever before.
Thank you. Thank you for your responses, Meeta and Rajni. I would just like to extend a version of this question to Shraddha. Shraddha, so Shakti pointed me to the concept of family status production work that I think Hannah Papanek has written sort of more in detail about. And Shakti had written to me that this is a type of reproductive labor that comprises activities such as helping with schoolwork, enrolling children in certain after school activities, and how this can preserve or improve class status. And I was wondering if I could get sort of your views on this from sort of working with informal women workers and the kind of pressure it puts on them or the additional burden it puts on them to improve their children's quality of education and school life. I see many workers from informal jobs sort of struggle to do another odd job, to do another few hours of labor so that the child can be enrolled in, say, an English speaking class or some kind of extracurricular activity. And this seems more to bring the children up to speed or to get them to able to access opportunities. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that while we're talking education and inequalities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, actually, from our research, we found that there were a lot of childcare deficits, in the sense of there was one woman who was a brick kiln worker, who would, have their work is seasonal. So her argument was it's either I can go to work or my child can go to school. The choice is that stark. So I think one of the things that we try to show in our research is when policy doesn't pay attention to the gender division of labor and tries to shift the gender division of labor more equitably across the care diamond, then the consequences are felt by women, other women in the household on whom unpaid care work burdens shift, as well as children who not only take up unpaid family labor and other home-based work, but they don't get sufficient care, their education, all of it they experience a deficit, a serious deficit. So, the trickle down effects on what happens with when there is when care work is not adequately addressed in terms of shifting it across the care diamond. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, very much, very much. Thank you, Shraddha. And now, Rajani, another question to you. When you were talking, you were speaking about informal and formal economies and how they're seen as sort of very different from each other, and how in the formal economies it feels like women have it all, and what do they lack. But even in the formal economy, there's a kind of intersectionality with different kinds of positions, right, across the pipeline, as Meeta and you were talking about, across the ladder. So, say something like maternity benefits, or taking into consideration care work that women have to do. Where do sort of formal economies and companies, IT sectors sort of stand in with respect to making these subjective, say from an entry level position to a leadership position, about which women can access and pay for care and which can't, and where do you see this kind of dialogue going in the coming months and years?
See, the um, I think when you look at the formal economy, maternity benefits are available to all women from the entry level to the leadership levels. That's not an issue. But what happens when you take 6 months off? What happens to your career is definitely an issue, because you lose out on a lot of the development opportunities. You lose out on job opportunities that are available to people who have the ability to give time beyond working hours. So if you consider your work week as a 40-hour work week, then you're definitely going to fall behind in the progress, in your career progress. If you're willing to, unlike men who are willing to give 50 hours or 48 hours or 60 hours, and therefore have that many more opportunities, women also step back because they are concerned that they may not be able to do justice to their care responsibilities. That becomes higher priority over career progression. The third thing is, yes, you can look at childcare. Um, Probably many women in the formal economy could afford it. But there is also this, what I talked about, right? The cultural conditioning that says, am I doing the right thing by allowing my children to be raised by somebody else? I talked to a young woman yesterday, and by young, I'm talking about the fact that her children are 10 and 6, and she gave up working because she said, we decided as a family that we would not have full time help. Right now, how did that decision impact her? She gave up her job to care for her home, her family, her children, etc. It and the entire impact was only on her career. It is not that she could not afford childcare, but that she chose not to do it because she believed that it was her responsibility to raise her children. Why isn't it a joint responsibility? The other thing is, childcare centers in India are not licensed, as far as I know. And I may be very wrong because I'm very far away from that phase of my life. But how do you know, as a mother, as a parent, that your child is well cared for? So if I have all of those conflicts in my mind to deal with, how good am I going to be at focusing on my work? And maybe I'm better off taking time away. The second thing is the Extended Maternity Benefits Act has another impact. I was talking to this entrepreneur who has 3 women going on maternity leave at about the same time. They were a small shop. They had about 20 all knowledge workers. Out of them, 3 are going to be on maternity leave around the same time. And his position is, I can't afford it. I have to keep the jobs open for these women when they choose to come back. They may never choose to come back, but for 6 months, I cannot hire somebody else to do that work. So I'm going to take a policy decision to hire fewer women. I just cannot afford it. Right? So there is a flip side to the extended maternity benefits as well for women's careers. It forces them into a caregiving role rather than a professional role.
Thank you, Rajni, for your response. Shraddha, just another, a twist of the same question to you. When we are thinking about policy schemes, actually to both Shraddha and to Lekha. So when we're talking about something like maternity benefits, for many women in the informal sector, um, getting pregnant or even accessing maternity benefits doesn't seem like a possibility. I mean, it almost becomes a question, more of a question of job security. Am I right in saying that? And your thoughts on that? And to Lekha, on how these are things that are taken into consideration while demanding for change in policy.
Just a couple of responses. One is to say that in the informal economy, obviously there are lots of different types of employment relationships. So there might be like domestic workers, a range of employers that a woman has. Women shift from job to job. There's a multiplicity of work that they do. So in fact, thinking about how maternity benefits, so it really becomes difficult to think of employer-led provisioning like Rajani was talking about in relation to the Maternity Benefits Act. In fact, I think there's quite a bit of feminist thinking on trying to think about how employers as well as the state can share, maternity benefits. And an insurance model like, say, ESI, where there is an employee contribution and employer contribution as well as state contribution. There are so many other ways in which maternity benefits are sought to be delivered in a way that actually benefits women. So I think even for women in the informal sector, I mean, of course, all of those that exist right now, the NFSA provisioning, the National Food Security Act, through the PMBVY or whatever that Vandana Yojana is, it's so minuscule. It's really a partial wage compensation, So women have no choice but to go back to work in very vulnerable conditions, or they end up either taking their the children with them, or of course dropping out of the labor force again. And some other consequences follow from that. So it's really without an adequate maternity benefit, a right-based universal wage that focuses on wage compensation, it's really difficult for women in the informal economy to actually manage their care responsibilities. And that's not the only thing, right? It's not just maternity benefits, it's also childcare provisioning. If a woman in a brick kiln, where is she to keep her child? Of course, there are many acts that mandate childcare provisioning in larger establishments that have over 50 women, like say the Factories Act. All of this is now subsumed by the whole labor codes. But what I'm trying to say is that if the state does not step in with, the Anganwadi, the ICDS system is supposed to be a universal provisioning now with equity and quality at the heart of it. And it does work well in some states, like in Tamil Nadu, for instance. So it's this twin thing of maternity benefits that are publicly provisioned, childcare that is publicly provisioned, and which is based on a rights-based understanding. That's the only way forward that I see for informal sector workers to have any semblance of support during periods of maternity and childcare, but also, as I said, there's a whole bunch of other policies that we also need to focus on.
Thank you, Shraddha. I was actually asking about maternity benefits just as a sort of a probe into all of those other things, but thank you for expanding on the many things available and not. Lekha, there's one question from a person who is watching us, and I think maybe also taking into account how we can have rights-based feminist policies. I'm reading out the question that we have. How might we insert a nuanced caste analysis into the whole paid versus unpaid work framework, given that Brahminical women tend to benefit from the labor of Dalit and historically marginalized castes that domestic workers tend to belong to?
Okay. Okay. That question directly relates to the elite capture. The moment the public policy makers make good policies for women, but our friend, I forgot her name. What's her name? She asked the right question, that whether there is an elite capture, that only privileged women are capturing this. And in my limited empirical evidence, only South Africa has done a beautiful analysis of the public policy with the interface between race and gender. Because the question she has put forward to us is that all women are not equal. If we start with the assumption that all women are equal and we frame the policies, the elite women, they may capture the benefits. So that benefit capture will not be there for the real needy women. So this kind of, lens, that it's not homogeneous, that you frame policies for women, but which women, that is also equally important. And usually in the analysis, we take only class into consideration, the income class. But this category of race or caste is equally important as a category to fit into this kind of policy framework. Otherwise, of course, this elite capture will happen. And I completely, agree with her point that all women are not equal. And coming to that question which Shraddha was responding to regarding the care economy infrastructural policies like providing childcare, our discussions, we were highlighting, of course, the childcare, but there are many aspects to this care economy. It's not only just the child care. So maybe the other thing is a compassionate care. If your close ailing relative is sick, and if the government is going ahead with the decision that we are on a fiscal austerity move, we have to cut down our health expenditure. The moment they lessen the number of days of hospitalization, the patient is back home, and who is a care provider? And that care provider's psychological, or in terms of many tensions, what she or he is undergoing in the outside, the market sector, those kind of perspectives are not yet into the health policy making. Because for the health policy making, the client is only the unit of analysis, not the care provider. And especially in times of pandemic like this, the care providers' perspectives, we need to incorporate into the public policy. And the compassionate care, I think only Canada is a country where you have a compassionate care benefits. Like it's a dignity. If your close, relative is ailing, and if you have to look after that, you are not on toes that anytime you have to go back to the work, but with dignity, you are given paid leave to attend that. So many aspects, and elderly care. In our country, I don't think that we have thought about this process, that integrative care economy infrastructure policy. That's very crucial, especially in the times of pandemic. So that kind of policy we have not thought, and that's what, if I asked to do a single most significant policy prescription before board, this is my take, that we need to think about an integrated care economy infrastructure policy framework of our country. Yeah.
Thank you, Lekha. I think what you just said summed up most of our discussions for the day, but also I think has given us sort of very specific things to think about going forward, and thinking about policy based on data and research. So with that, I'd like to bring this session to a close. And first, I'd like to thank our very wonderful speakers, Lekha, Rajani, Shraddha, and Meeta, for joining us today and making this discussion fruitful, exciting, and possible. In spite of tech glitches and last minute things, I think that we managed to do this, I think I'm very, very thankful for. Thank you, Swarna ma'am and Shakti, for asking me to do this. I certainly learned a lot, and I think I have more reading and more thinking to do. Thank you, FES Global, for doing this along with Prajna and making this series possible. With that, I say thank you very much for all the participants, also for being here, asking questions, and making this an exciting discussion. Thank you and bye.